In the spring of 1941, the German Fallschirmjäger, the paratroopers, were the most feared elite force in the world. They were the Sky Devils, the cutting edge of the blitzkrieg that had shattered Eben Email and neutralized the Low Countries in a matter of hours. To Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, these men were his personal Praetorian Guard, a living symbol of Nazi daring and technical supremacy. As the planning for Operation Mercury, the invasion of Crete, began, the air of arrogance in the Berlin war rooms was suffocating. Göring and General Kurt Studin viewed Crete not as a difficult objective, but as a stage for a grand theatrical display of air power. They believed that the mere sight of thousands of German parachutes darkening the Mediterranean sky would be enough to cause the inferior British, New Zealand, and Greek defenders to break and run. They looked at the maps of Crete and saw a prize that was already theirs. Their arrogance was rooted in a dangerous delusion that past success guaranteed future victory, and that an elite status made them immune to the friction of war. They were preparing for a parade, not a slaughter, convinced that the decadent British Empire had no answer for the vertical envelopment they were about to unleash. The foundation of the disaster at Crete was built on intelligence reports that were more fiction than fact. German Abwehr intelligence, led by Admiral Canaris, provided General Student with a picture of Crete that was dangerously sanitized. They reported that the British garrison was exhausted, disorganized, and on the verge of evacuation. More critically, they assured the paratroop commanders that the local Cretan population would either remain neutral or, even more absurdly, welcome the Germans as liberators from British colonial rule. The German High Command embraced these reports with a hunger born of ego. They wanted to believe the enemy was weak, so they ignored every piece of evidence to the contrary. Their arrogance blinded them to the reality that Crete was being turned into a fortress by nearly 40,000 determined troops. They dismissed the idea of a civilian uprising because, in their racial hierarchy, peasants did not fight back against professional soldiers. This was the first fatal error. They were planning an invasion based on what they wanted to see rather than what was actually there. They were flying into a trap of their own making, fueled by a contempt for the enemy that would soon be paid for in blood. On the morning of May 20th, 1941, over 500 Junkers J-52 transport planes, the Iron Annies, roared across the Aegean Sea. Inside, thousands of elite paratroopers sat in cramped silence, their hearts pounding with the adrenaline of certain victory. The German plan was a masterpiece of complexity and a nightmare of logistics. It relied on absolute precision and the total suppression of enemy anti-aircraft fire. The German commanders, in their hubris, believed they could orchestrate this massive air armada with the delicacy of a symphony. They ignored the warnings of their own meteorologists and flight leads about the blinding dust of the Cretan airfields and the vulnerability of the slow, lumbering Ju-52s. To the generals in Athens, the transport planes were just numbers on a board. To the men inside, they were flying targets. The arrogance of the leadership was such that they didn't even provide adequate radio equipment for the different waves of attackers to communicate. They assumed that the German spirit would overcome any lack of coordination. As the first shadows of the planes touched the Cretan coast, the generals were already celebrating a victory they had not yet earned, oblivious to the fact that the British were watching them on radar, their guns loaded and waiting. As the jump signals turned green, the Sky Devils leaped into the morning air. But the sky over Malomé and Heraklion was not the empty void they expected. It was a wall of lead. The British and Commonwealth forces had perfectly predicted the drop zones. The German paratroopers, hanging helplessly from their chutes, were met by a storm of machine gun and rifle fire. Their arrogance regarding total air superiority vanished in an instant. They had jumped without their heavy weapons, which were dropped in separate canisters, a fatal flaw in German paratroop doctrine that the generals had refused to change despite lessons from the Dutch campaign. This was the peak of tactical hubris, the belief that a soldier could fight his way to his weapons while under fire from an entrenched enemy. Men were being shot before they even touched the ground, their white and camouflage chutes turning crimson. The elite status of the Fallschirmjäger meant nothing to a New Zealand soldier with a Bren gun. The generals in Athens, safe in their villas, received fragmented reports of heavy resistance, but dismissed them as minor local setbacks. They couldn't admit that their perfect plan was disintegrating into a localized massacre.
The most shocking blow to the German ego came not from the British army, but from the people of Crete. As the paratroopers landed in olive groves and vineyards, they were not met with flowers, but with kitchen knives, ancient rifles, and farming scythes. Men, women, and the elderly rose up to defend their soil with a ferocity that the German racial doctrine had deemed impossible. The German generals were horrified. Their arrogance had convinced them that subhuman civilians would never dare attack the uniformed elite of the Reich. When paratroopers were found mutilated or killed by villagers, the German reaction was one of stunned, self-righteous fury. They couldn't understand that their very presence had ignited a total war. This civilian resistance threw the German timetables into chaos, forcing elite units to fight house to house against grandfathers and teenagers. The generals' refusal to account for the human element in their planning cost them the element of surprise and turned a military operation into a brutal, scorched earth struggle. It was the first time the Wehrmacht encountered the true meaning of a people's war, and their pride would never truly recover from the shock.
Realizing the airdrop was failing to secure the ports, General Student attempted to send in reinforcements by sea. A makeshift flotilla of Greek caiques, small wooden fishing boats, was packed with German mountain troops and sent toward the coast. The arrogance of the German naval planners was staggering. They assumed that because the Luftwaffe controlled the day, the Royal Navy would not dare intervene at night. They were fatally wrong. On the night of May 21st, the British Mediterranean Fleet, under Admiral Cunningham, intercepted the light flotilla. In the darkness, the massive 6-inch guns of British cruisers pulverized the wooden boats. Thousands of German soldiers, many of whom couldn't swim and were laden with heavy gear, were cast into the cold Aegean. The Royal Navy showed the Germans that air superiority was a hollow phrase when the sea belonged to the king. The German high command in Athens was paralyzed, watching helplessly as their seaborne invasion was deleted from the map in a single night of fire and steel. Their belief that the British would play by the rules and stay away from the coast had led to a watery grave for an entire regiment.
By the third day, the invasion was on the brink of total failure. The only hope for the Germans lay at Malmö airfield, where a small group of paratroopers was clinging to a sliver of land. The German generals, desperate to avoid the personal embarrassment of defeat, ordered a suicidal all-in maneuver. They began landing Ju-52s directly onto the airfield, even while it was still under British artillery fire. Transport planes crashed into each other, burned on the runway, and were shredded by machine guns, but the Germans kept sending them. This was the arrogance of the desperate. They were willing to burn through their entire transport fleet just to say they had captured a runway. Through sheer bloody-minded attrition, they eventually forced the New Zealanders back, but the cost was astronomical. The airfield was a graveyard of Junkers aircraft, a twisted metal monument to a victory that was rapidly becoming too expensive to celebrate. The generals called it audacity. History would call it a reckless gamble with the lives of their finest men. Even as the British began to evacuate Crete, the reality of what the Germans had lost began to sink in. The Sky Devils were no longer a cohesive force. Some battalions had lost 70 to 80% of their men. The elite 7th Flieger Division was practically destroyed. General Student, walking among the thousands of white crosses in the olive groves after the battle, was a broken man. He had won the island, but he had lost his army. The arrogance of the planning stage had been replaced by a grim, silent mourning. The Fallschirmjäger would never again be the same. They had been used as blunt force infantry in a meat grinder, their specialized skills wasted by leaders who treated them as invincible pawns. The myth of the German paratrooper as an untouchable super soldier died in the dust of Crete. To the world, it looked like a German victory. To the men who survived, it felt like an ending.
The most profound consequence of the arrogance at Crete came from Hitler himself. When he saw the casualty lists, nearly 4,000 dead and 2,000 wounded in just 10 days, he was horrified, not out of a sense of humanity, but because he realized his prestige force had been decimated. In a private meeting with General Student, Hitler famously remarked, "The day of the paratrooper is over." His arrogance shifted from overconfidence in the airborne harm to a total dismissal of it. He decreed that there would never be another large-scale German airborne operation. The thousands of hours of specialized training, the billions of marks spent on transport fleets, all were tossed aside because the initial plan had been too arrogant to succeed. For the rest of the war, these elite jumpers would be used as green devils, elite ground infantry, denied the very wings that made them famous. The failure at Crete didn't just kill men, it killed a revolutionary way of war for the Third Reich, all because the generals couldn't plan for an enemy that fought back.
The German ego, wounded by the resistance of the Cretan people, turned to a dark and bloody revenge. In the villages of Condomari and Kondanos, the paratroopers, acting under orders from General Student, carried out mass executions of civilians. They claimed it was retaliation for illegal warfare, but in reality, it was an act of frustrated arrogance. They couldn't stand that unarmed peasants had humiliated the elite of the Luftwaffe. These atrocities were an admission of defeat. They were the actions of a bully who'd been punched in the nose and responded by burning the house down. This moral collapse was the final stage of their hubris. They believed that they were above the laws of war and that any resistance to their superior will must be met with extinction. These massacres would haunt the reputation of the Fallschirmjäger forever, turning their military glory into a legacy of shame in the eyes of history. Looking back at the mechanics of Operation Mercury, the logistical arrogance is staggering. The Germans had failed to secure a reliable water supply for their troops in the blistering Cretan heat. They had failed to provide adequate medical supplies, expecting the weak British to surrender before the first bandages were needed. They had used parachutes that couldn't be steered, leaving their men at the mercy of the wind and enemy snipers. Each of these technical failures was a byproduct of the same mindset. We are Germans. We will find a way. They believed that will was a substitute for water, and that bravery was a substitute for bullets. By the time the German mountain troops were being ferried in to save the paratroopers, the invasion had become a chaotic scramble for survival. The eagle hadn't just fallen, it had tripped over its own overcomplicated and under-resourced plans. What the German generals never knew, and what their arrogance would never let them suspect, was that the British had a secret weapon, Ultra. They were reading the German Enigma codes. Every detail of the secret invasion, the drop zones, the timing, the numbers, was known to the British commander, General Freyberg, days in advance. The Germans were so convinced of the unbreakable nature of their Enigma machines that they never even considered the possibility of a security breach. They flew into a prepared killing zone, certain that they were masters of surprise. This scene highlights the ultimate blindness of the Third Reich. They believed their technology was a magic shield. They spent the entire battle wondering why the British guns were always in the right place, never realizing that their own pride was broadcasting their moves to the world. By June 1st, 1941, the battle was over. The British had been driven from the island, but the cost to the Luftwaffe's transport fleet was so great that it would hamper German operations for the rest of the war. Hundreds of Ju-52s, the backbone of German logistics, lay rotting in the Mediterranean or smashed on Cretan hillsides. The Eagle was grounded. The arrogance of General Student and Göring had not only cost them their elite troops, but had crippled the very transport system they needed for the upcoming invasion of the Soviet Union. Crete was a tactical victory, but a strategic catastrophe. It was a success that Germany could not afford to repeat. The paratroopers, once the pride of the air, were now bitter men, their wings metaphorically clipped by a victory that felt more like a funeral. Post-war history often tried to paint the German paratroopers as different from the rest of the Nazi machine, as knights of the sky who fought a clean war. But the ghost of Crete tells a different story. The arrogance that led to the invasion also led to the war crimes that followed. The elite status, they claimed, was used as a justification for the brutalization of the Cretan people. This scene deconstructs the myth of the chivalrous paratrooper, showing that when their ego was bruised by a determined enemy, they resorted to the same barbarism as the SS. The Fallschirmjäger were a product of a regime built on the belief of their own inherent superiority, and Crete was the place where that superiority was tested and found wanting, both militarily and morally. Today, the German military cemetery at Maleme overlooks the airfield where so many sky devils met their end. The olive trees grow peacefully now, their roots weaving through the soil where the blood of 20 nations was spilled. Crete remains a haunting lesson in the dangers of military hubris. It is a story of how a perfect elite force was sacrificed on the altar of a general's ego. It reminds us that no matter how specialized the training, how advanced the weapons, or how elite the status, a plan built on the contempt for the enemy is a plan for a massacre. The fallen eagle is not just a title, it is a warning from history that pride truly does go before a fall, and in the case of Crete, that fall was from 10,000 feet into an inferno that the arrogance of Berlin refused to see coming.